Some content warning. This episode contains discussion of suicide, cyberbullying, and animal distress. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling, call or text the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988. Welcome to Vet Watch at DVM 360. I'm your host, Christopher Lee. Today's episode covers a story that's painful, complicated, and deeply human. Heidi Pretzel is the associate editor at AG Daily, blending real-world ranch experience with a background in ag marketing, education, and communications. She holds a master's degree in agriculture science and extension education. She has worked across the western U.S. and led communications for the Arizona cattle growers. Based in New Mexico, Heidi is passionate about connecting rural communities with honest, accessible AG content. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you for having me today. I appreciate your time and calling me out to this podcast.
Thanks so much. Now, you recently wrote a powerful article called When the Herd Turns, Mob Mentality That Killed a Veterinarian. And so for listeners that are unfamiliar with this case, can you kind of walk us through what happened and what inspired you to write this piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a pretty complex issue, I think, as you've touched on, but ultimately for me, as somebody that uses social media, I'd come across videos in the story of a Las Vegas area veterinarian, including images of him working on a horse and striking a horse. And um, then the next thing I knew, we were hearing bits about this veterinarian potentially disappearing, potentially committing suicide. And along with that, there was a mob of internet, I think you would call it cyberbullying. The vitriol involving this situation was incredibly intense. I was personally pretty disturbed by the situation and by the amount of internet hatred that people were spewing across the web, across social media, other forums. And so, it was just a really complex situation that brought in anywhere from horse owners to animal activists to other veterinarians. But some of the loudest voices in that conversation were condemning Dr. Frainer, his actions. And there was a large number of people and some louder voices that were celebrating his disappearance and ultimately his death.
And that all happened fairly quickly from the time that that video surfaced to the point that he disappeared. How long was that?
I'm gonna have to go back and I'm gonna have to look at that. Um, I don't actually have the
Yeah.
timeline.
Oh, actually, so what I have was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but April 3rd of this year, 2025, that's when the video surfaced. And within 3 days, he had disappeared, but his car, wallet, and keys were left near Lake Mead. And then on April 18th, his body was recovered. So a pretty short time from surfacing to disappearance. It was only about 3 days.
Correct. And then I believe it was in May that they confirmed that he did have barbiturates in his system as well. Is that the timeline that
It
you're
is.
familiar as well?
Yeah, it took a little bit of time. His confirmed cause of death was drowning with pentobarbital, which is the common medication used as euthisol that we know in the small animal side, and that was what was confirmed in his system.
Correct. Correct. Yeah,
And
no,
and so, Doctor, oh, go ahead.
no, please continue.
So, Dr. Sean Frainer's death has now been confirmed as a suicide, and based upon that timeline, from the viral spread of the video to the disappearance and recovery, I mean, how do you kind of interpret that role of the backlash leading up to the time frame of his death?
Yeah, I think the biggest part for me is how heartbreaking the story was in general, not because we lost a veterinarian, but because it exposed how quickly and easily outrage can override facts and compassion. Um, that's why I ended up writing the story is I wanted to give some context to what happened and then also the human cost behind the headlines. Um, while we can't really definitively link online backlash to his suicide, the timing and the sheer volume of hatred and calls for his death and then subsequent celebration of his suicide, uh, I think suggests that there was a profound impact. and I think we've seen it time and time again. We're seeing it in, our youth, and suicide rates in our youth, and the effects of online bullying on some of our student population, and mental health. That public shaming can be devastating, especially if somebody's carrying heavy emotional burdens.
Yeah. And that damage is beyond that individual. It's not just him. There's multiple generations. He left by he was survived by both parents, his wife, three children, and three grandchildren.
Yeah, and a whole community, I think,
Yeah.
that that's known him and used him as a veterinarian for decades, as you've suggested. And I know I had a number of his clients reach out to me after the article who were devastated by his loss, and shared stories of how he'd helped treat their animals and helped them in, difficult times in their lives.
Now, let's get into a little bit about what led up to the video itself. So the kick. Thousands saw it, and for those that are outside the large animal world, many were horrified. And as a fear-free certified small animal veterinarian, it was shocking for me. However, when I asked the opinion of multiple people in the cattle and horse industry, the response I heard repeatedly was, I see far worse every day. So
Yeah.
can you kind of help contextualize this for the broader audience?
Absolutely. I think to start with, I do want to say that we should never be condoning any type of animal abuse. I think that it's important as producers, as animal owners, as livestock handlers, and as veterinarians, to understand that the vast majority of people are in this profession or own these animals, because they really do care. And while accountability is really important here, I think my overarching feeling in this situation is that, we can hold people accountable while still holding space for human tragedy. And, the video was shocking. I'm not going to lie, when I saw it, I wasn't happy with the depiction of it. Now, things can be difficult in handling large animals, especially horses. I understand that that horse was not a full-grown animal at this point, but all it takes is one kick, one stomp, one charge, one headbutt, if we're dealing with cattle, for example, and lives change forever. I think in the US, there's 100 to, I think nationally, we have 100 to 200 horse-related deaths per year, which is um, a sizable figure given the number of people that actually own horses. Is relatively small in regards to the population. But in this video, it showed Dr. Frainer attempting to restrain this animal. There was a rope around its neck. The facilities were, in my opinion, in shambles. They were inadequate to house the animal, as Dr. Frainer, I think, had later stated in a post. And they were struggling with, getting this animal properly sedated. Dr. Frainer himself had responded to some of the online comments in a post that was later removed, saying that he regretted his actions, that he was attempting to, the horse had had obstructions to its breathing, is what he had said. And so he was struggling to get that horse to stay conscious. I'm not a large animal veterinarian, but I've helped with a large number of castrations with other large animal vets, and sometimes livestock don't respond particularly well to sedation. So I think that is certainly a discussion there. The hardest part about this situation, though, is that the only people that really understand and know what happened in that time were the people that were there, and one of them's dead.
Right. Now, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect too. I think on one side, you have people outside the large animal industry and some within that are horrified when they see that video and they watch that kick. On the other side, you have people within the large animal industry that say, well, I mean, it's not necessarily okay, but far worse occurs. So isn't this video maybe more about that disconnect rather than Dr. Frainer himself?
Yeah, I think you really hit on an important topic there. For me personally, coming from the production ag industry, from the livestock industry, horses are still livestock. As much as people have put this spiritual value on horses, and as much as Americans, we love horses, and they're beautiful, wonderful animals. I love my horses probably more than I like a lot of people. But at the end of the day, they're large animals who are going to react how they are designed, either by their creator or natural selection, how they're designed to react, which is based on their survival as individuals and their survival as a species. And I think part of that disconnect between the general population and even the population of horse owners is that as Americans, we're 3 generations removed from the farm.
Mm.
And so the average American doesn't understand how production agriculture works. The average American, hasn't handled large animals. If they have, it's been in very controlled environments, or smaller numbers of horses. And so it's different, when you're handling even thousands of animals a day, like some large animal vets do. They're out there preg checking 1,200 head of cows a day going through a chute versus even a horse owner that owns 1 or 2 animals and have a really minimal interaction with them. And in this case, this horse was not halter broke. He was not well handled. That was supposedly part of the reason why he was being castrated, is so that he could go on and be handled more safely. But some of that onus, ends up falling on large animal veterinarians, farriers, et cetera, equine professionals in situations like that, that the average horse owner isn't equipped to handle. And I think it's fair to say, based on the facilities and fact that this horse wasn't adequately prepared to be handled by a veterinarian, that was probably the case here.
Which is a good point, which is also part of it is that choice of him to work with that horse under those circumstances. I mean, that is also part of the choices that led to this. And you mentioned this a little bit, but speaking about horse specifically, according to KTNV, the owners had purchased a wild Mustang, now named Big Red, for $50 and were trying to break the horse to resell it. And according to News 8, Frainer said, as you had mentioned, he was attempting to reposition the horse to help it breathe, but he did recognize and admit that he did kick the horse and wished that the situation had never happened. But I mean, what are some of the risks of working with an unbroken wild Mustang?
I think, you take all of the risks in dealing with large animals in general. For those of us that are in the agricultural industry, I think, we talk about how, the average American's removed, like I was just saying, and how they don't understand agriculture. I think on the flip side, as people that are involved in large animal production and people that are involved in large animal veterinary medicine, we're busy. And so we're not always the best about explaining what's happening and telling our story either. And anybody that's working in the agriculture industry, anybody that's working with large animals has either had, some type of injury or knows somebody that's had some type of injury, even has had family or friends that have passed away from working on the farm or working with livestock. I think almost all of us can speak to that. I don't think I know any horse veterinarians that haven't broken at least some bone in their body handling somebody else's horse or handling somebody else's livestock. And so, it's like I said in that story, it just takes one kick, one bite, and lives change forever or they end. And that's something that the average American isn't necessarily faced with on a daily basis.
Yeah, I remember as a vet student, my very first year, they were trying to have us understand how dangerous this was, especially for people like me that had no clue about large animals. And I remember our teacher, he pointed to a large dent above the garage and he goes, "Do you see that?" And we're like, "Yeah." He goes, "Yeah, that's where I was kicked by a cow and thrown up there and I made that dent." One of my classmates also had, from a large animal kick, had her spleen removed from that on an emergency basis. Now, speaking of those weight differences, now again, per KTNV, the owner of the horse stated, "It's like if I were to kick a child in the face because they did something wrong." Now, these horses can weigh 700-800 pounds. So is that comparison fair?
I think there is some onus on us as intelligent beings that are owning and handling these animals to learn how to do it as well as possible. That being said, I think there's a human factor here that we have to consider. in that everybody makes mistakes in the heat of the moment when you're trying to stay safe, when you're trying to get something accomplished. Things may not always be done ideally. I think about the times that I've, you know, gotten after my daughter in a situation and maybe, given her a little bit of a butt chewing and told her that she was being naughty in a situation that maybe it was a little extreme. Um, the difference between a child is that you can go back and apologize. A horse usually, they have a different take on things. They're living in the moment. But when we talk about that, horses are incredibly hard on each other. An average adult horse is 1,000 pounds. I think this animal was younger, so it was a little bit lighter, probably around the 700, I think is what I've read, pound range, give or take. But horses break bones. They cause immense damage to other horses with kicks and with bites, especially when we're talking about young stallions. It's not uncommon for them to cause um, even fatal damage to each other in situations where they're interacting with each other. I I think about I have a horse outside named Joe, and Joe is a gelding, and he's been a gelding since he was very young. But he's kind of a bully, and Joe has a way of really angering any animals that he's turned out with. He's actually in sole confinement now because he has had his jaw broken by other horses that have kicked him, split right in half, and we had to wire it back together. He's had a leg broken by other horses. He's had arteries. I went out to feed one day and he had his front leg opened into the artery and it was spewing blood 4 feet up in the air. Um, and I think that's a testament to, the damage that horses can do to each other, another 1,000-pound animal, and it just doesn't compare to a human child.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, again, it doesn't make, as we had stated, it's never okay to be kicking another individual, animal, or otherwise. But it's not quite the same when you're, as far as forces, just from a physics standpoint, even though it doesn't make it right. Some of the risks are very different. But switching that a little bit, I mean, from the horse owner's point of view, I mean, I understand their frustration. And if anyone feels that violence has been committed against their pet by a veterinary professional, they have many options. There's law enforcement, there are state boards, and both government agencies are there to protect the public at no cost to the people reporting. Additionally, there's civil action, which, depending on the circumstances, may or may not cost the person money. But either way, there's many options. Now, the family of Red did report the incident with the Nye County Sheriff's Office, and he was being investigated for animal abuse. But one of the problems is that none of these processes, the investigation from Nye County Sheriff's Office, or if board complaints had been submitted, none of them had time to play out. Dr. Frainer's case was tried in the court of public opinion. I mean, once those videos were posted to news agencies and or social media, reaction was fast. And so should the American public let government and legal process proceed before turning to news or social media? What are your thoughts?
I think that's a really important point that you make there. When we're looking at these videos, it's oftentimes hard to keep context clear. Everybody's coming in with emotions and opinions and everything else. And that's one of the interesting things about social media is that news travels very fast and very far. But one of the detriments I think that we found to social media and online discussions. And to answer your question, I mean, absolutely, we need to hold space for investigation and for facts. The rush to judgment here and the celebration of his death and even prior to his death, the amount of hate and, like I said before, vitriol shows how dangerous it can be when due process gets replaced by viral outrage. And there's a few people there that know the whole story. I'm not sure how much of the story the owner was familiar with, given that the video looks like it was taken from inside the house. I've read different things about the owner saying that her mom was maybe having a seizure or a health episode. Obviously, nobody knows what was going on in the house except for that owner and her mother at the time. and nobody knows 100% of what was going outside except for Dr. Frainer and his veterinary techs. And the sad part about this, I mean, beyond the loss and the other tragedy, is that none of us are ever going to get that whole story because we didn't allow due process to complete.
Right. And that's what, again, the sheriff's office, state boards, that is their role to investigate. So if there is issues, there can be repercussions, for that, and maybe a changing of behavior to try to improve things rather than how things played out. And with some of the comments on social media, I mean, they appear to celebrate his death. And while that footage of Dr. Frainer was upsetting, the response seems deeply unsettling. So, kind of what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that a lot of those responses reflect something that is darker in our digital culture, that hunger for punishment over understanding. It's one thing, like we talked about, to demand accountability, but it's another thing to dehumanize somebody to the point where their death is seen as justice. There's like I said before, there's no denying that accountability matters, but so does compassion. We can recognize systemic issues and still hold space for human tragedies. And I think one of the things here that is important for us to understand and important for us as people that are handling animals, and it doesn't matter whether it's small animals or large animals or, large livestock, that sometimes the temporary discomfort of an animal is needed in order to keep them safer or keep them healthier or to make them, a good citizen. And, I look at it, just the other day, I was out castrating a calf for my neighbor. And I realized what a bad situation I put myself in the middle of it. And now I'm kind of berating myself and looking back and, thinking about what I should have done differently. I'd gone to flank this calf and to castrate it. And that neighbor has livestock guardian dogs. And there were no livestock guardian dogs around when I flanked that calf, and I was in the middle of banding it. And out of nowhere, one of these 100-pound Pyrenees came out and bit me in the face while I was on the ground. Very minor injuries, but ultimately that lack of, consideration for the situation and that lack of planning could have resulted in severe injuries for myself and ultimately the death of an animal that was just doing its job to protect the stock that it lives with. And, it's just things like that where, one bad decision could lead to even worse consequences for animals or people. So I think it's important to look at those issues and understand, the dog can't understand that flanking that calf and laying it down and castrating it is something that has to be done. And the calf doesn't understand that. But ultimately, we as people can better prepare the situation so that nobody's put in a bad space.
Yeah, it's a good point. Sometimes when those situations kind of start, they unfold down a path, and there's a point of no return many times, that which can be challenging. And again, coming back to that cyberbullying, can you kind of describe what is cyberbullying and how that kind of affects veterinary professionals or people just generally in the ag industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So anybody that's seen any of, the keyboard warriors jumping on here and having strong opinions about anybody's stance, I think kind of has a general understanding or feeling of what cyberbullying is. But typically it includes threats, harassment, even public pile-ons, typically through social media. For vets, I'm not a veterinarian, but I've seen it happen, time and time again with friends who are large animal veterinarians and small animal veterinarians, but they're facing, a lot of people in my generation are facing quite a bit of debt. They're facing even burnout early in their careers, emotional trauma. And, I think for somebody that set out, I don't think that anybody set out into a veterinary medicine career to hurt animals. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and he said, I went to school to help animals. And he said, what I didn't realize is that I would get so good at killing animals.
Hmm.
And just for clarification here, he's talking about necessary euthanasia of animals. But as somebody who's teched for veterinarians, I know there are days when I've ridden around and we've euthanized, 7, 8 large animals with really distraught owners and sad situations for the animals. And I can't imagine, you know, being in that situation all day, every day. And I think working with livestock, it happens. Anyway, that cyberbullying can be crushing, whether you're in this capacity as a veterinarian or in another capacity, but we're seeing a rise in suicide. I think that some of the numbers out there suggest that suicide rates are getting better. Um, but one of the more concrete numbers that you can find is that vets are 2.1 times more likely to die by suicide than the average person. And then female vets are 3.5 times more likely.
Yeah, there is some disparity, like in discussion with some of those numbers. So there are some that do show that. Again, there are also ones that aren't necessarily showing a difference with overall suicide rates. It's actually kind of a challenging put it together.
Yes.
One of the ones I have seen that seemed fairly not in dispute was that veterinary professionals, they have a higher rate of ideation of suicide than the general public. And certainly I think with what you mentioned, they're under already a level of stress that is different than what other people are normally under. Having to put animals to sleep when you've gone into profession to help animals and you're euthanizing them, it is stressful. I know a hospital that they actively limit the number of euthanasias per day just for the veterinarian's mental well-being.
Yeah, that's pretty neat that they can do that.
It,
Of
it
course,
is. It then becomes sad because any of these animals that are suffering that do need this transition, and yet, what happens to them too. So it is a very difficult situation.
yeah, and I think there's a, standard of care for animals too, that as medical professionals, you see that maybe animals aren't always being handled or housed or treated according to the standard that you would like them to see. And I'm sure that there's, some mental health impacts for veterinary medical professionals based on that. No understanding and knowing the ideal, and then seeing a lot of less than ideals and seeing animals suffer and, ultimately sometimes die has got to have its toll on people that went into this to help animals and to help people with animals.
Now, again, coming back a little bit to the cyberbullying, because it's one of those, with the owner and the family of the horse, right? Absolutely well within their rights to submit that video to the sheriff's office, to the state boards, taking civil action, right? That's why those processes are there. Once we get it into news agencies and social media, that response, starts to be can get out of control. And so with cyberbullying, again, when you post a video, which isn't necessarily wrong in and of itself, but the response, like you had mentioned with cyberbullying, I loved how you said that there's a way that we can try to correct the behavior, be upset, but at the same time, have some overall compassion about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that one of the issues that people were pressing from that were in support of Dr. Frainer as a professional and very upset with all the cyberbullying that was going on and the hatred. And um, I know I was pretty floored by some of the comments. I had gone into our post on Ag Daily and I just responded to somebody and I said, but did he deserve to die? And the response that I got back from that individual was, well, he clearly thought that he deserved to die. And I was blown away by that lack of regard for human life, that lack of value for human life. Uh, you know, again, like I talked about, the temporary discomfort of an animal, I don't think trumps the life of a human. When we're not talking about just full on abuse, we're not talking about somebody that's out here intentionally starving animals or just beating animals for the heck of it, or um,
But
you
again,
know,
even if it was, bad behavior does not justify bad behavior.
it does
And
not.
so, the cyberbullying, that is its own type of violence.
It
And it,
is.
right?
Correct. And there was some of those people that were supporting Dr. Frainer who had responded in comments, and I know had discussed pressuring local law enforcement to pursue libel and some of those legal issues. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to the legality of it, but I know that there was people who were understandably upset with a lot that went on, and they felt like a lot of those comments and the video being posted was in an effort to hurt Dr. Frainer as an individual and to hurt his business. And so they were trying to pursue legal action against some of those commenters and against the original poster of the video.
You know, we need to get back to some type of civilized society. I mean, we can be upset with Dr. Frainer's action. We can, be upset with the facts and the actions, but it's a very different situation than cyberbullying. You can say that's not okay. Is law enforcement looking into this? What about state boards? That's fine. That's a fair discussion. But the moment we start to celebrate, like wish him ill or celebrate in his death, that all of a sudden changes it from communication and discourse into that realm of cyberbullying. Would you agree?
I would definitely agree with that. And I do think it's important to be able to have, you know, some public commentary about it. It's important to be able to discuss situations, but as higher thinking individuals, I do think that I would hope that eventually as a society we can get back to actually understanding that there's so many sides to a story like this and allowing that person to tell their side of the story. And there's screenshots of the post that Dr. Frainer made, and in his post, he had explained his situation and explained what he said he was doing, and he had also apologized, and he'd said, I'm so sorry. And I don't know why that post was taken down. None of us probably are ever going to know, but how wonderful would it have been to actually have that response from the individual in real time to discuss where he was at and what had happened, and even to answer for what he did wrong.
Well, and it comes back to, I think the video speaks more about a disconnect of some people in the large animal industry, their life and what happens, and everyone else. And, there, may very well be, that we need to have change, but that is about a cultural change within that industry rather than focusing in on one person who's from there.
Yeah, I would agree. It was interesting because I'd written that article, and you know, one of the things that I said in there was that we've all had one moment that we're not proud of, whether it's stealing with our kids or handling livestock or riding horses or whatever. I look back to just this weekend when I was riding my own horse, and there's a few times when I'm an amateur rider. I'm trying to learn a sport and always trying to get better, but there were times when my timing wasn't perfect. And so, my horse kind of took some of the brunt of that. And the goal is always to do better and be better. But that's part of the human experience, and that's part of being a human. And as long as we can work towards that goal of being better and doing better, there's going to be mistakes that are made. And I don't know that we need to be crucified on social media for some of those mistakes instead of being encouraged to learn and do better together. And, I saw one of the Facebook groups or pages, I think, had really called for Dr. Frainer's death and had had a lot of really negative things to say about him. And then when it was confirmed that he had committed suicide, there was a number of individuals that were celebrating that on that particular group. And they went as far as to post a video of our article and discuss how, I should be fired from my job for admitting to animal abuse and to writing this article and et cetera. And, I think it was a pretty good demonstration of that mob mentality and, that situation where people are feeling so angry and justified in singling people out, and that cyberbullying, I guess.
Well, and I find it interesting that do they recognize the hypocrisy of wanting someone's death over violence? Like you're wanting violence to address it. And, I understand, watching you and I watch that video. I don't think any animal should ever be struck, right? That's not what the ideal is at all. And certainly in the large animal space, I think that largely that doesn't really happen. But in the large animal, sometimes it does, which again, I think then the people that are upset about it, condemn the action. And instead of maybe hope for his death, how about hope for change, hope for enlightenment, and that maybe he feels bad and that we can make sure that no horse ever gets kicked again. I mean, those types of comments I would support because that's not a cyberbullying situation.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I do think there is, there's a difference if you haven't ever handled a horse or you haven't ever handled, a cow as a similar size and weight. Um, I was talking to a friend about one situation where I was 9, 10 months pregnant and we had a heifer who had a calf stuck in her and we were trying to save her life. And that heifer chased me around the barn for about 2 hours before we got her in a head catch. And it took a lot of motivation to get her into the head catch because, she just knew that she was in pain and was understanding that we were causing the pain to her and we were just trying to save her life. And, sometimes those situations are less than ideal, even though we had good facilities at the time. Um, our head catch that we were running this heifer through kept failing. And I wasn't as fast or as athletic with an extra, 30 pounds on me. So it was a little bit of a tough situation. And I was so thankful that, we were able to save her. Um, she went on to, have a couple calves much easier and in a much more peaceful situation out in the pasture. But, there are times when things do escalate and, we do the best to handle the situation with what we've got at that time. Um, and, I think that you had mentioned QPR
Mhm.
training that you've personally gone through. And
Yes, I have. And again, for the audience, QPR suicide prevention. It stands for question, persuade, and refer. There's multiple training courses out there. I've taken the QPR suicide prevention modules myself, and I really recommend everybody that's listening and watching this podcast to go through that training. I don't know what other things can be done. Do you recommend?
yeah, there's QPR, I think is a really great discussion. It's something that in the education field we're talking more and more about. And, cyberbullying is a big thing in this upcoming generation. I'm appalled by some of the things that I see kids saying online and posting online. It is really surprising to me that we have adults doing the same thing. And so I don't know where the solution is with that, but I think that we can all take some time to slow down before sharing content. We can work on seeking context. We can speak out against cyberbullying. And then there are ways that we can support mental health in ag professionals, checking in on people. And of course, that goes when I say ag, veterinarians as well, but checking in on, people and helping promote resources. We do have some resources. I think all of us are pretty familiar with Not One More Vet. If you have vet friends online that share that hashtag, as well as the AgriSafe Network does some work. Some of the state organizations do as well. Um, and those can be resources that we can share and then reaching out to people that we have a relationship with and just seeing how they're doing.
Yeah, there's a lot of options out there.
Yeah.
And I think you'd mentioned something too, taking accountability for what we say. Words do hurt and words do matter. Otherwise, they wouldn't have said them.
Yeah, it's easy as a human being, and that's what it goes back to for me, is that that's part of the human experience. Is we're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna say the wrong thing. Sometimes we're gonna say the wrong thing out of anger. Now, of course, there's things that can be said and done that are not as forgivable, but it's part of it. It's part of understanding where you make that mistake and, being more cognizant of what you're saying and what you're doing. And then, being able to apologize and, explain how you could have done things better in that situation as well.
So as we reflect on Dr. Fraynier's story and the profession as a whole, any final thoughts that you want to leave our listeners that we haven't covered?
Sometimes, as an animal owner and a horse owner, I've been frustrated by the work that's been done by veterinarians, by situations that have been handled in ways that I personally felt were less than professional. But at the end of the day, veterinarians aren't villains and they're not superheroes. There is not any overarching statement, I don't think, that describes any one individual as a person. Most people are out there doing the best they can in high pressure situations. And I hope that we can learn something from this and hold people accountable when needed, but with the same empathy that we'd want for ourselves. And I think that's an important lesson, an important part of this human experience. And ultimately in learning how to, to deal with large, dangerous animals, or even it's funny because I was looking at, the number of horses and horse related deaths and in the worldwide is a better number, but you look at dogs and there's quite a few, dog related deaths in the US. And I know some people who have been faced with dog related tragedies. And, there's, I think, about 100 dog deaths annually, depending on the numbers, in the United States. And so I think it's important to understand that, not only just learning more about that human experience and holding space for people and accountability, but also we have an obligation as owners of animals and understanding and doing better by our animals. And part of that is understanding how animals think and how animals react. And we're constantly trying to learn how to do things better in the ways that we handle, especially large animals, but small animals too. And understanding that there's differences in the ways that predators react versus prey animals like cattle or horses or, sheep or goats or whatever it may be. But I think there's an important story to that as well. And, just like talking about, I got bit in the face the other day by 100-pound Pyrenees, and that was not that dog's fault by any means. Thankfully, I had minimal injuries from it, and I accept full responsibility for the bad position that I put myself in. But, how do we do things better? How do we learn from those mistakes and understand that there's some mistakes that you can't go back from?
I love it. Very, very good summary on that.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, can you tell us a little bit about Ag Daily and your work there?
Yeah, thank you for that mention. Ag Daily is a digital publication that focuses on agriculture and rural life and food production. We have a commitment to, honest storytelling. We want to uplift ag communities, but we also want to be able to address complex issues like this one. Anything from weather to animal welfare to mental health conversations like the one that we're in. And so if you'd like to take a look at our publication, we're at www.agdaily.com. And of course, I'm always happy to learn more about people in the US and Canada and the stories that they're sharing. And so thank you for taking the time to read our stuff.
No, thank you. And we will have those links in our post.
Thank you so much.
So it's been terrific having you on this show. I hope next time it will be for something happier, but
Yes.
we'd love to have you back.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
So again, if you or someone that you know is struggling, please reach out to the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by calling or texting 988. This is VetWatch at DVM 360.